we're back. We're back with part two of the argument about pressure groups becoming more or less powerful, and this is the one that says no, they're not. What's happened is we've had changes in the pressure group environment, but the power structure remains the same. There's a difference between noise and power. And in fact, the new environment in which pressure groups operate actually widens the political capital divide. And so, yes, some have benefited, but others have not. So this really is the argument. This is going to be the counter-argument to the various points that we made earlier. Let's see where we get to. Right, okay, here we go. So, first things first. Yes, we talked about the changing nature of political participation, about the changes from rational to rational choice, from tribal voting. However, we can argue that that actually doesn't help pressure groups at all, because Westminster is still dominated by the traditional parties. If we look at the Greens here, for all of the noise that the environmental movement has made, the Greens have still only got a single seat in Westminster, and indeed their presence in Scotland has fallen from 7 to 2. So basically, we wonder if the Greens are going backwards. And at the same time, what this raises is the question of checkbook activism, or as I came across it the other day, slacktivism, which is a great idea, which is the idea that by simply being a member of a pressure group, we feel like we're making a difference. And maybe this is my conscience speaking here. There is a huge difference between actively being engaged in politics and maybe just signing a check a couple of times a month or a couple of times a year. So are people engaged in politics more by virtue of pressure groups? Well, there are certainly more pressure groups, they're more noisy, but does that necessarily equate to more people being engaged in? And more importantly, does it mean that they're more influential? Or are they just really adding to the background noise that accompanies modern political movements? Excuse me. So, are pressure groups more powerful? Well, there's more of them, but they haven't changed the outcome at national elections very much at all. We've still got Conservative governments, we've still had Labour governments, and I don't think we can attribute the coalition to pressure group activism. So the Westminster government is still dominated by political parties from the big groups. Ergo, pressure groups are essentially just noise. They're not really changing things. If pressure groups were changing things, then we'd have a much bigger presence for the Greens. So that's one particular argument. Then we can look at changes in policy formulation. We talked earlier about how the fall in ideological certainty has created opportunities for pressure groups to come in and to try to get their point across. However, a couple of things that we've got here. There's greater opportunities for points to get involved, pressure groups to get involved, but that doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to be influential. And again, if you look at my presentation on alcohol pricing and, of course, indeed fags on the other fags as cigarettes, then that's going to be relevant. Arms trade is another one where the engagement of people in the debate doesn't actually change the fact that we are heavily reliant at an economic level on the arms trade. Flood defense is another interesting one. Policy forums have not really changed much there. And I think the other area that's not mentioned on here, but that is probably worth investigating, excuse me, it's completely slipped my mind, would be, yes, the fuel protests. I did say that you should have a look at the fuel protests from 2000 and the way in which the government was forced to respond because of the tactics of the pressure group rather than perhaps the way in which they were trying to get their message across, or the message they were actually conveying. Changes in technology. This again creates greater opportunities for pressure groups, but does it mean that they're getting more powerful? In fact, you could almost argue that what we've got here is a case of diminishing returns. The more pressure groups they are, the more background noise they make, the easier it is perhaps to just turn them off. The key idea here is that yes, there's a lot more noise and a lot more chatter, but does that equate to the same amount of influence? And what we find is no. The amount of influence these things have is not necessarily a function of their noise. It's to do with other things. It's to do with strategy. It's to do with contacts. It's to do with the way in which they involve themselves in the policy argument. So the ease with which one can start a pressure group now doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be any more influential or any more powerful. It just means you can start a pressure group easier. So that's an interesting point. And I think the same is true really when it comes to the media. We talked about the way in which the media has created greater opportunities for pressure groups to get on TV and get their message across. But again, that doesn't mean that anyone's going to be listening. Do we get diminishing returns? Is there more noise but not power? And I think here you could talk again about the way in which the Green movement is very much part of the media present. But again, we're not really changing the way that we act. In fact, with the fuel protests, again, the environmental agenda was kicked into the long grass as soon as the government found itself being squeezed. The fuel protests in 2000 were all to do with the duty escalator that attached to fuel prices increasing steadily. That was very much driven by the environmental lobby. However, when push came to shove, the government backed down. And there we go. So, very, very interesting. Other stuff, let's move on. We've got here the rise of professional lobbying. Now, this is one area where, yes, the ability to commandeer or pay for expertise is going to help you to get across, and it's going to tell you how to use your political capital most effectively. So this is a huge change. This is a very, very big change. But the difference is, this costs money, and so it's only those groups who know how to press those points, who know how to use their assets effectively, who are going to be able to exploit it effectively. And here we're right back to the cigarette argument, and I think particularly if we look at who's in charge of the WSTA, the Wine and Spirits Trade Association, versus the TMA. Then there's a clear contrast. The booze industry has been an awful lot more effective at protecting its interests. The booze industry has essentially managed to resist all efforts of the government to legislate it into a small space. Cigarettes have been much less effective. Now, why was that? Perhaps it's to do with the way in which they've deployed their resources. The booze industry, very, very effective. And as we say here, the benefits from professional lobbying extends only to those groups who can press effectively. And perhaps the best example of that is the government response to the financial crisis of 2007. The financial crisis of 2007 was undertaken by reckless lending by the financial sector. I'm obviously rounding up quite dramatically. It's very, very complicated. But essentially, this was a monumental mistake made by the banks. How did the government decide to correct it? By giving more money to the banks. Now, when you put it like that, you think, hang on, that just doesn't make any sense at all. And you're absolutely right, it doesn't, until you think about the way in which the banks were able to lobby the government to bail them out of the hole into which they dug themselves. If the government was really interested in trying to restart the economy and trying to kickstart the economy by generating mass consumption, why give money to banks? Give it to the consumers. The idea was that the banks were going to lend that money to consumers, but they didn't. They just used it to cover their bad debts. And why was that? Well, because they were able to lobby the government much more effectively than all of the other groups. Or rather, there was no other group that was able to lobby to the same extent. Increased pressure points, devolution, all of those things. Again, this rewards those who are already powerful. Those groups that are well-resourced will be able to exploit all of these things. And, well, you got some ideas there. Right, now, I've kind of gone through that very, very quickly. We need to come and we need to talk about this. We need to talk about these ideas. We also need to talk about the foot and mouth epidemic of 2003. I'll check that. But the foot and mouth epidemic is another very, very good example of how pressure groups reward those with resources already. This is a complicated issue. Hopefully that gives you an idea of some of the areas you need to be looking at, some of the areas the examiners will expect you to talk about. But that's not the answer. The answer is going to come when we discuss this in class, and I look forward to doing so. Come and bring your questions. See you soon.